uh, and sharing your perspectives, your thoughts and your insights. Thank you to the media that you're always there in big numbers, so we have to acknowledge their contribution. So today we are privileged to have from the World Bank senior economist Dr. Dhruv Sharma. He has a very very long and productive career, and I was hearing him talk about the various institutions across the globe that he has been. But it's not just his experience is not limited to the World Bank. He has been with institutions. I heard Australian Treasury, and that is definitely a very serious experience when it comes to macroeconomic management. And he's here as a country economist at the World Bank. And I hope you all know when we get a representative from the World Bank presenting a keynote paper, it comes with a lot of research background. One of the highest qualities that you can expect. The World Bank has this advantage. The advantage is that the World Bank is able to recruit the best talents in economics and other fields.
ওইটার ভলিউম বন্ধ করে যায়, ওটা বন্ধ করে দাও, ভলিউম বন্ধ করে চলো, এটার ভলিউম বন্ধ করো।
We must recognize the fact that the World Bank has a very global reach when it comes to expertise. They get the best experts, the best graduates from the various universities, not only limited to the United States, but if they scan around the world, they get the best talents. That is my experience. So, and when they make a presentation, particularly the presentation today is not just a Bangladesh development update. There's a theme, and the theme is a business environment that delivers jobs. Jobs, jobs, and jobs. This is where the critical economic activity and economic indicator for Bangladesh. Around the world, there is a crisis, job crisis. The youth unemployment is very high. In Bangladesh, they talk about a 40% unemployment rate among youth. That's a dangerous, situation. So creating jobs is going to be the ultimate goal of the new government. Question is, what is the path to creating those jobs? You have to have, our understanding, you have to have growth. You don't have growth, you don't see job creation. But then the question is, what kind of growth creates more jobs? And creating jobs, the next jobs drive poverty reduction. So that is the next thing. So growth, jobs, poverty reduction go hand in hand. In the Bangladesh context, the experience of the past 25 years, particularly up to about 2020 from 1990 onwards, is very clear. Growth was enhanced starting in the 1990s. That created jobs, and the poverty rate, which was 60% in 1990, that came down to 18.7% by 2018. And that is a story of growth, but job-creating growth, and which came through a lot of liberalization, trade openness, which gave a boost to our export sector. So these are connected developments. And we would like to hear our presenter today describe Bangladesh's development story. The recent story, of course, this is a development. This is, I think, do you have a quarterly or a
Biennial.
biannual? So it's a 6 monthly assessment of Bangladesh's development performance, and we hope to hear some insights as to what has been working and what is not working, perhaps. So, and what is the way to go? What is the way forward? So, with those few words, I would like to invite Dr. Tu Sharma to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very kind introduction, especially with a bit about experience and quality. But we're hoping that everyone will be able to take away something from today's presentation. This is a biannual report. We release it in April, so it's fresh right now. And the second edition of the year is produced in October. It coincides with the World Bank IMF spring and annual meetings. The report is split into two parts. The first looks at our assessment of the economy. And then the second part of the report delves a little bit deeper into a special topic. The theme for this particular edition, of course, is a business environment that delivers jobs. For the past few editions, we've been trying to unpack a little bit the job story in Bangladesh. We've done other topics in between as well. We had a look at financial sector reform as well, but there's a recurring theme about jobs, and the reason for that is simply put, it is probably one of the pressing issues that needs to be addressed, not only in Bangladesh, but many different parts of the world as well. Simply put, there aren't enough jobs that are being created to absorb all the new entrants into the labor markets around the world. It's particularly acute of a challenge in Bangladesh, and I'll come to that in a moment. What I'll do is I'll start by just summarizing briefly our assessment of economic developments, followed by our projections for where we think the economy is going over the next couple of years, and then I'll come back to the jobs story after that, along with some policy recommendations that we think might be useful for Bangladesh to consider as it grapples with some of these challenges. By the way, if you do want to download the report, you can do so. It's available publicly. There's a QR code on the screen, which you can use to download the report. And all of the information that I'm presenting here today is contained there. So let me just start with the key messages, just so that we can contextualize what we discuss next. I think the headline message, and this is not new to anyone who's been following the Bangladeshi economy, is that economic growth, the momentum has slowed over the past few years. Right, so the numbers that we've been seeing recently, they aren't a surprise. They're a continuation of that trend that we saw over the last, say, 3-4 years. We saw subdued economic activity in the first half of this fiscal year as well. And what the reason why we're saying, that we're trying to contextualize what we say is it gives you a sense of where we might be headed to next. And this year, our projection for growth is 3.9% this fiscal year. So the fiscal year that's just ending in 26 on June 30. And then we have an upward trajectory going forward. So of course, 3.9 is faster than Bangladesh grew last year. It was about 3.5 last year. The number 3.9, look, these are point estimates. There's always a bit of a confidence interval around these estimates. It's a revision downwards from where we were 6 months ago. 6 months ago, we were forecasting growth of about 4.4%. So it's a little bit slower, and that's partly a reflection of new data that has come out recently, as well as the impact of the war in the Middle East. Right? And Bangladesh goes into or is dealing with this crisis with a set of pre-existing challenges. These challenges predate the Middle East conflict, and the ones that concern us the most is high inflation, persistently high inflation, low domestic revenue mobilization, financial sector vulnerabilities, and growing external pressures, external sector pressures. None of this should be a surprise. You've probably seen a lot of this in the press. It's being debated. Institutions such as PRI have also flagged some of these issues in its various events and papers. So the reason why we're saying, I'm highlighting these 4 issues is that Bangladesh's ability to deal with the shock in the Middle East has to be contextualized with what it's dealing with domestically. And the main takeaway there is that Bangladesh has limited ability to absorb the impacts of a shock that is prolonged. Right, that's the takeaway message here. And the reason for that is there are 2 primary reasons that underpin that assessment. One is that policy space is limited, and external buffers are also limited. So what we mean by policy space being limited is that fiscal policy and monetary policy, you could argue both of these have limited room for maneuverability to be able to help mitigate the impact of what is going on in the Middle East and how that's affecting Bangladesh's economy. When it comes to limited external buffers, Bangladesh has done a pretty good job of shoring up its foreign exchange reserves over the past 2 years. I began my posting here in July 1, 2024, and I remember when I landed, Bangladesh had about $18 billion in reserves. It's now double that. It's done a pretty good job. Our rough rule of thumb is that you need about 3 months worth of prospective coverage for prospective imports. Bit of a mouthful, but all it means is have you got enough reserves to be able to pay your import obligations. When I landed, Bangladesh had about 2.5 months of import coverage, and now it's got about 3.5 months of coverage. But it's still just a little bit above 3, which is what we consider to be the sort of minimum amount that's comfortable for a country to be able to deal with shocks. I'll come to each of these. I'll come back to these policy issues just in a moment. Just to point out why we think fiscal space and monetary policy space is limited. Fiscal Bangladesh has this sort of implicit rule of having a 5% ceiling. Space is limited because Bangladesh does not collect enough tax revenue. It's as simple as that, right? So if Bangladesh is to meet its development obligations or development ambitions, it needs to collect more and spend better. The tax to GDP ratio is hovering at just under 7%. For a country like Bangladesh at a similar state of development, 15% is what's considered to be a bit more comfortable, and Bangladesh is less than half of that. Whenever there is a challenge on the fiscal side, when expenditures increase, when pressures increase, particularly on the expenditure side, like Bangladesh is facing right now with higher subsidy bills, higher import bills, and so on. There's only so much the government can do because they're not collecting enough, and something has to give on the expenditure side. Typically, it ends up being capital expenditure because a large part of the expenditure side of fiscal is taken up by salaries, pensions, and so on. So it's very sticky. When it comes to monetary policy, the limited space assessment, there's no hard and fast rule here, but you do have elevated inflation. So that limits the ability of a central bank to think about cutting anytime soon, even in a low growth scenario. I mentioned that growth had slowed down for several years. What we saw last year was the first contraction in growth of private investment in 35 years. So when you think about Bangladesh's economy, 70% comes from consumption. Now 25% or so comes from investment, and what's left over is Bangladesh's trade story. It's a bit less than that even, actually. So 70%, which comes from domestic consumption, that's largely stable. It's been growing a little bit slower than it has in the past, but it's still growing at 5-6%. It's that investment side which has really taken a big hit over the past several years. And I mentioned limited physical space, and the first thing that typically happens when it comes to flexibility on the expenditure side is perhaps social spending or capital expenditure is cut when consolidation efforts are made. For those of you who are economists in the room, if you break down the economy into very crude terms, capital and labor, if you continually hurt the capital part of that sort of relationship, that limits or places a constraint on potential growth. So for a few years ago, if you'd asked us what was Bangladesh's potential growth rate, one would argue it was maybe 6.5. If you're asking that same question now, I think most would say it's close to 5. Now, if you're to achieve the ambition of becoming $1 trillion economy in the next few years, this is going to be difficult with subdued rates of investment growth. It's investment growth that we really need to pick up, and then of course there's this link with the business environment and jobs, which I'll come back to. What were the implications for poverty and welfare over the past couple of years? Prior to the Middle East conflict, and over the last 3-4 fiscal years, a number of people were being added to poverty in Bangladesh. We were projecting that the number of people, we were actually projecting people would be lifted out of poverty this year. That's still the case, but post-Middle East war, we reassessed the numbers. So prior to the Middle East, the onset of the Middle East conflict, we were projecting that 1.7 million people would be lifted out of poverty. Now we're projecting 500,000 people to be lifted out of poverty. So still an improvement of where we were over the past 3 years, but you can see how precarious the place that improvement really is. And of course, the implications of a prolonged conflict will have ramifications for this as well. High inflation, sort of limited productive jobs, weak labor incomes. This has all hurt poverty, as well as a slowing growth momentum of the past few years, which explains why people were being added as opposed to being removed from poverty. Thinking about the labor market, simply put, job creation in Bangladesh was insufficient relative to the amount of people entering the workforce. Over the last decade, about just under 15 million people, so I think about 14.7 million people entered the working age population bracket. Of those, 8.7 million people were absorbed into the labor market. So there's a big gap there between supply and demand. And that gap is growing. So every year, Bangladesh has about 1.5 million people that enter the workforce. Only about half of those are getting jobs. Now, we saw a structural shift in Bangladesh that began in 2016. Up until 2016, Bangladesh's economic trajectory followed the sort of traditional development story with workers moving out of agriculture, moving into manufacturing, moving into services. From about 2017, there was a bit of a gap in this trend, and in fact, since then, for the past 7-8 years, almost all jobs have been created in the agriculture sector. In fact, manufacturing has shed, an industry has shed jobs, right? And this in itself is not so much of an issue, but typically the jobs in the agriculture sector, which are absorbing all the new entrants, they happen to be less productive, and they happen to pay less than jobs in the other sectors. So this is why we're paying a little bit more attention to what is going on and why in that particular space. I mentioned inflation a couple of times now. Look, inflation has come down over the past 2 years. As I said, when I landed here in July, it was about 2024, it was about 12.5%. It's hovering about 9%. So the central bank did a commendable job of anchoring expectations of the past 18 months or so. There was also clear-cut communication about which direction monetary policy would take, depending on which direction certain variables move. So I remember the former governor made a point of saying that considerations about moving on interest rates, maybe perhaps to a more accommodative stance to support growth, would only be taken once the real rate was 3%. And so what that really means is the difference between the policy rate and inflation. The policy rate is 10, inflation's 9, so your real rate is 1. So until that equation changes a little bit, the monetary policy stance was not going to be changed. And so when I said earlier that our assessment is that perhaps space on the monetary policy front is limited, it's based on this communication about how decisions will be made. The other point to make here is when we think about monetary policy typically is quite effective when it comes to influencing demand side factors which are driving inflation. Right? In Bangladesh, a large proportion of the consumer price basket is taken up by food, fuel, and shelter. Right? And we've seen food prices remain elevated for the better part of the last couple of years. And monetary policy has a limited impact on affecting those prices. What affects those prices are supply side issues. Of course, demand as well, but what's keeping food prices elevated are supply side issues. Here, I mean gaps when it comes to infrastructure, getting produce from farms to markets, having adequate cold storage along the way, so that perishable goods can be transported. Bangladesh has quite high logistics costs. Supply chains aren't as efficient as they possibly potentially could be. And then there is, of course, disruptions caused by artificial distortions created by groups that control various parts of the supply network. Right, so these groups also then distort prices by the time produce gets to markets. So in order to combat inflation effectively, you need to think about both the demand and supply side factors. And to resolve supply side factors, you need to get more than just the central bank thinking about it. Sorry, just one final point when it comes to inflation and the link between poverty and welfare. I mentioned earlier that because inflation had remained high, we've seen challenges when it comes to labor incomes. So the growth in real wages for those in low-paid jobs or unskilled jobs, these people have taken a hit to real wages. So real wages for people who fall into these categories has actually been negative. So the prices have risen and their wages have not risen at the same pace. In fact, they've fallen in terms of purchasing power. One other final point about monetary policy is the link with investment and credit growth. So what we've seen over the past 2 years or so, there's been a sharp spike in lending to the public sector at the expense of lending to the private sector. Why this is important is it goes back to what I said earlier about investment in Bangladesh being well below where it probably should be if Bangladesh is to grow faster. So whenever we speak to businesses, and there are several representatives in this room who can share their views on this, they do mention that the cost of borrowing is high, the cost of capital is high when they want to invest in new factories and so on. It's expensive to borrow. At the same time, almost unanimously, everyone has told us that that's not the primary reason why we're not expanded. There are other reasons why we're not expanding, and they largely relate to access to electricity, water, infrastructure deficits, as well as policy uncertainty. Right? So cost of capital is high, but this is both a demand side problem and a supply side problem. From the supply, I've just mentioned the demand side. On the supply side, banks have become a little bit more prudent when it comes to lending as a result of new standards that have been placed in the banking sector when it comes to thinking about loans, banks should lend out to, the high amount of NPLs in Bangladesh's banking sector, and the severe undercapitalization of the sector as well. And that leads very nicely to the next slide, which is covering financial sector vulnerabilities. There are two issues here that concern us. The story about the non-performing loan ratio in Bangladesh being 30% plus 35% in September last year, that typically takes the headlines, and rightly so, because it is a very high number. One issue that doesn't get the headlines as much, and it's slightly more complex to unpack, particularly in public discourse, is the significant undercapitalization. And this should not be. When we think about financial sector, banking sector vulnerabilities, these two go hand in hand. Bangladesh's system-wide regulatory capital stood at about 4.5% roughly. The minimum standard globally is 10%. So it's just under half, and a big concern. Again, when we think about the supply side when it comes to lending, you can see very clearly here, if you're undercapitalized, there will be challenges. Now, a lot of the recent reforms, particularly the reforms of the last 18 months or so during the time of the interim government, focused on increasing transparency. And this, of course, exposed a lot of concerns about asset quality, particularly amongst Islamic and state-owned commercial banks. So this is an issue that still needs resolving, and it needs to be done reasonably quickly. The costs of delaying this grow day by day. The estimates out there in the public domain suggest that recapitalization of the banking sector could be in the order of 10 to 12% of GDP. Now, when you're running a fiscal deficit of 4.5%, that's a lot to absorb, even if you do so in a phased way over several years. So having the right tools to be able to resolve issues in the banking sector are critical. And what I mean by right tools is having the right regulatory framework, legal framework to be able to resolve banks. Last year, several of these tools were sort of put into play. There was a Bank Resolution Act. There was a move to define NPLs according to international benchmarks. There was rules related to transparency in corporate governance, related to ultimate beneficiary ownership when it comes to banks. So a lot of these things are now coming into play. What will be important is to enforce those. I mentioned the fourth source of concern in terms of pressures, the external sector. The story here is interesting, and it's and you know, remittances plays a big part of the story. Remittances coming in at $3 billion a month at record levels, partly because you do have a little bit of a narrowing between the formal exchange rate and the informal exchange rate, and the government incentive, the fiscal incentive that's being provided by the government for remittances to come through formal channels has also played a role, and the stability in the exchange rate. Right? You can argue that you know, that there's room for improvement when it comes to exchange rate management. It is still very stable despite moving to a more market oriented exchange rate over the past year or so. But it has helped with the remittances story. The remittances story has masked underlying vulnerabilities on the trade side. Specifically, exports have not done well, particularly this year. In fact, in the first half, as you're all probably aware, export growth actually contracted. Imports are still coming through. Trade balance has taken a hit. However, the current account balance hasn't exploded simply because you've got strong remittances. Right? So going forward and thinking beyond remittances, it's really the trade story that Bangladesh needs to think a little bit carefully about. There are two reasons. Well, there are several reasons why exports haven't performed so well over the past year or so. Two reasons come to mind as the topmost two reasons is trade policy uncertainty with, and this is global, with you know, changes in the US's stance on trade policy, and also intensified competition with other export markets, for example, the EU. Now, this is all, you know, Bangladesh has, of course, put in a proposal to defer LDC graduation for another few years. And there's quite robust arguments why, you know, Bangladesh should get a deferral. There's equally robust arguments to suggest that, you know, regardless of a deferral, the decisions about how to adapt once that deferral expires, if it's granted, those decisions need to be made now and preparation needs to be done now. Bangladesh became eligible for LDC graduation, I think, in 2018. And of course, that's several years ago now. So along that, since 2018, you've had the COVID-19 pandemic, you've had the Russia-Ukraine conflict, then of course the July 2024 revolution, and then now the Middle East crisis, a whole host of events that have perhaps stymied the progress that might be made when it comes to LDC graduation. But if you're seeing events such as these every couple of years, there's no saying that there won't be any events for the next couple of years. So you may as well get started in the reforms that you need to undertake so that Bangladesh is prepared when it eventually graduates. And those reforms haven't changed, right? I mean, at the centermost of those is leveling the playing field. Certain sectors in Bangladesh have received quite a lot of support. If that same level of support was extended to others, or the playing field for other sectors was leveled, then perhaps you see that move to diversification, which Bangladesh sorely needs and urgently. I mentioned intensified competition. You know, even if Bangladesh defers, it still needs to think about what its competitors are doing. So, you know, Vietnam, Cambodia, India, they're all moving forward with trade deals. So Bangladesh needs to act quickly so that it is able to deal with those changes as well. Fiscal policy, the key takeaway here is collect more, spend better. It's very easy to say, and it's not new. I've given you some of the stats. You know, Bangladesh collects about 7% of GDP when it comes to tax revenue. It gives out around 6.5% in exemptions. So when you collect 7, you give out 6.5, you don't have a lot of room to play with. You know, the fiscal deficit will take a little bit of a hit this year as a result of what's going on in the crisis. I mentioned we revised our growth projections. We also revised our projections for the size of the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit. So our current account projections prior to the conflict were about 0.4% of GDP. They're now 0.8%. And our for fiscal, it was, I think it moved from about 4 to 4.4% of GDP. So another half a percentage point has been added to the fiscal deficit as a result of the conflict, as well as the decisions the government is making to try and mitigate some of the impact via increased social spending, and of course, bank recapitalization costs are being factored in as well. So, just briefly on the impact of the Middle East conflict. 6 channels: current account, inflation, fiscal, growth, poverty, and inequality. There's not a lot left, but these are the ones through which there will be direct exposure. I've mentioned the exports and imports story. Remittances, we're watching carefully because you would expect them to potentially be impacted if job prospects for those Bangladeshis working in the Middle East are affected. If they've lost jobs, they might not be able to send more. When it comes to foreign outflow of workers, I think there are almost 10 million Bangladeshis living and working in the Middle East. On average, about 85,000 Bangladeshis leave Bangladesh every single month. This is an average for the past several years. Over the last 2 months, about 45,000 left. So half of those will be able to go. The reason I mentioned these 2 points is because, of course, there might be implications for remittances then going forward. Inflation, higher domestic energy costs. You've already seen one increase in the prices that you pay for fuel. Depending on how long this conflict extends, it's not beyond the realms of thinking that there might be other hits there as well. I won't mention poverty and inequality because I dealt with those. When it comes to growth, again, breaking it down into 2 parts: consumption and investment. Investment relies a lot. Relies a lot on imported capital. Input costs have risen. So in an environment where borrowing costs are high, given what we get told by representatives of the private sector, where investment growth contracted, if you raise input costs, this will have implications for investment. What does this all translate to overall? I mentioned we've got our growth forecast down to 3.9% this fiscal year, then gradually going up to 4.5%, then 5.5%. Now, these forecasts were done about 2 months ago, just when the conflict started. So even if you do a little bit of a reassessment of where we are now, you can see that trajectory is at risk unless things get resolved quickly overseas. I've also mentioned that we had to increase the size of our current account deficit projections. We're expecting the current account deficit, so as a percentage of GDP, to hover around the 1% mark, partly based on the remittances story, but also we are expecting a little bit of a pickup in exports, not by a lot over the next few years, and we're expecting imports to be growing faster than exports, but at a slower trajectory than prior to the conflict, partly because of higher import costs. Now, so what are some of the reform options that Bangladesh has, or might be considering? Look, in the short term, the priorities are, of course, to stabilize the economy, right? Lay the groundwork for structural reform, which then creates the preconditions for increase in sustained job creation. So there is limited policy space, so you need to use that prudently, right? So prepare, what that basically means is, and the government is already doing some of this, is allow partial pass-through of costs so that the subsidy bill isn't hit so hard. You can protect the poor and vulnerable by then through temporary and targeted transfers. These two words are important because it's very easy to give out money, and it's very difficult to stop giving out that money later on. So the temporary part is critical because you're not able to sustain that over a long period of time. Targeted basically means know who you're giving it to and give it to those who are vulnerable. That requires having a well-targeted system for identifying where the vulnerable live. Having a social registry, a dynamic social registry, using that effectively is critical. Inflation, as I said, the focus right now might be to alleviate some of the food price pressures by thinking about what's distorting supply. When it comes to government financing needs, again, this is an issue on the fiscal side. Increasing domestic revenue mobilization, it's very easy to say, it is the headline sort of takeaway, but how to do that in the short term, there are options. And the report contains some detailed suggestions. One of the main things is that VAT could be looked at as a starting point. And the other thing that can be looked at is the amount of exemptions there are in the system at the moment and whether those can be rationalized. Increasing transparency around exemptions is critical. And what I mean by that is whenever you are thinking about exemptions, maybe table them in front of Parliament, and then Parliament decides which exemptions go forward and not. Those exemptions that have sunset clauses, maybe let them expire, right? Having a VAT by definition it is a regressive tax, so it hurts everyone, right? However, you can mitigate the impact on poorer households by having certain exemptions for goods and services that they consume. I'm talking about basics, food, medical, hygiene, and so on. So there are lessons from other countries that can be taken from there as well about how they've done. So they've introduced GST, VAT type taxes, and then also protected the vulnerable. Banking sector, I've gone over that, so I won't repeat myself now. There's only one line there, but it's critical, which is on reducing regulatory and trade constraints. And the reason I've left that is because I have a little bit of the special focus looks particularly at that issue. I mentioned stabilizing the economy in the short term of this next 6 to 9 months is critical because having strong, robust macro fundamentals actually is a necessary precondition for creating more and better jobs, right? So in this edition, when you're looking at the business environment in Bangladesh, what constrains it, what stops job creation, there are a whole host of reasons. And it's interesting because in this part of the world, as is the case in some other parts of the world, there's an expectation that it's the government's job to create, government's role to create jobs. There's an equally important role that the private sector plays. Simply put, the government cannot absorb all the new entrants into the labor market. It's not well placed to do that. So the private sector has to take some responsibility. And if that is not being taken, we need to try and understand what is preventing that. And the business environment is one issue. And it's a very broad issue. So I'll highlight a few things. I've already mentioned those big headline sort of messages about, for almost 15 million new entrants in the labor market, 8.7 of those 8.7 million people getting jobs, jobs being created over the last 8 years or so in low productivity sectors. A lot of females who enter the workforce, they also got jobs in the agriculture sector. In fact, labor force participation for females fell from 42 to about 38% over the last few years. And this is at a time where a lot more Bangladeshis have tertiary degrees. So several years ago, if you looked at this NEET category, not employed, educated, or in training, those with tertiary degrees, 10% of those were not getting jobs. That number is close to 30% now. Right? So again, that challenge of absorbing new entrants into the labor market and productive sectors and industries, you can see how that is playing out with some of these statistics that I've been mentioning. Now, Bangladesh, when it comes to the business environment, has a large productivity gap. What we mean by that is that revenue per worker in Bangladesh is only about 1/3 of South Asian benchmarks. So the top, and there's sort of a pyramid sort of a structure here. The top 10% of firms in Bangladesh generate about 75% of all the sales, right? But they only employ about 15% of the workforce, right? And these high productivity firms, they dominate output as well as exports. Low productivity firms dominate employment. So you have this dualism that's created. And so what are some of the top constraints to firm growth and job creation? One of them that almost all business representatives have mentioned to us is the regulatory burden that they face, the time and cost tax, if you like. We've done surveys, extensive surveys where we've interviewed both employees and employers across sectors. Senior managers in Bangladesh tell us they spend, just under 15% of their time complying with regulations. In some parts of Bangladesh, it's even more. I mean, there's this statistics that my colleagues were telling me, which struck out a little bit. Managers in, for example, Borishal spend 60% of their time working on regulatory compliance. I mean, not a lot of time is being spent to actually focus on businesses and business operation. There's also a monetary cost. The formal businesses, it can cost them approximately $10,000 to try and figure out how to comply with regulatory issues. When it comes to competition, Bangladesh has one of the lowest scores in all of South Asia for the Be Ready index. It basically means entry and exit is very difficult for firms. There's so much compliance, there's a lack of information, which all prevents firms from entering and exiting. We speak to different industry representatives, and they tell us that they'll go to one department to seek information on compliance, and they'll be asked to go to another department for another piece of paper, and to someone else. They might not even know the liaison officer in that particular department from whom they need to get stamps or papers. And this goes on and on and on. Whereas some other industries have a little bit more of a structured approach. So the RMG sector has a more form of institutionalized, if you like, approach. They know who exactly to approach. So the other sectors that we speak to say, if we had that type of interaction, it would make our lives a lot easier as well, right? So when I was speaking about the leveling the playing field, when I was talking about diversification, people often think that's coming at the expense of the RMG sector. That's not the intention. The idea here is to level the playing field to the other sectors and also try and grow. I mean, Bangladesh exports 45-50 billion when it comes to the ready-made garment sector. The next largest sector is the footwear and non-leather footwear sector at 1.5 billion. I mean, that's a huge gap, right? I mean, that calls for some change. Thinking about productivity, particularly in SMEs and in formal firms, there's a whole host of things that can be done in this space. there are some stats, a Bangladeshi worker, we did comparisons with Bangladesh, India, China, and Vietnam. And on average, as I mentioned earlier, a Bangladeshi worker, so revenue per worker is only about 1/3 of South Asian benchmarks. So when you're, again, if you place this in context with Bangladesh's trade performance and where trade is going, and the trade sort of story is going to go over the next few years, intensified competition has serious implications. So trade reform is central for Bangladesh's growth story going forward as well. I'm going to pause now because I have a feeling, and I don't know if I'm wrong, but I may have spoken more than I should have. But
It's fine.
You're
It's absolutely fine,
absolutely
sir.
brought in so many new things that
Okay.
focusing on.
So,
I'd like to raise some questions.
But if somebody has more to say, just.
So I mean, these are the main points. I think I've opened up. There's details in our report that I would encourage you to look at because we go into a little bit more detail. We have some more specificity about what can be done to address some of these issues. I mean, I've highlighted the issues at play. Some of the solutions are also being thought about, and some of those solutions we have put with some detail into this particular report. So with that, I'm going to pause and back to you so that we can move to the next part of this.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is an enormous addition to the discourse on the state of the financial challenges. So, lots of new thoughts and ideas. So, for the benefit of media, since they always ask for online foreign, so আমি যেটা করবো ওনার যেসব বিষয়গুলো উনি উত্থাপন করেছেন কয়েকটা এগুলো মনে করি যে these are key messages বা key takeaways ওনার বক্তব্যে সেগুলো আমি চেষ্টা করবো একটু বলতে try to first provide the key takeaways before I pass on to our distinguished panelists who will also make their observations. So I'll start from the last of the program. So উনি যেটা বিজনেস এনভায়রনমেন্টের যে চ্যালেঞ্জের কথা বলছেন এখানে কিন্তু উনি একটা কথা বলছেন যে ইনসেন্টিভ এখানে ডিস্টর্টেড ইনসেন্টিভ আছে তার মানে যে ট্যাক্সেশন সিস্টেমে উনি বলতেছেন এখানে রেডিমেড গার্মেন্টকে একটা মানে এক্সট্রা তাদেরকে লোয়ার রেটে ট্যাক্স করা হচ্ছে অন্যদেরকে হায়ার রেটে ট্যাক্স করা হচ্ছে 27.5% is a standard tax rate সেখানে রেডিমেড গার্মেন্টরা পাচ্ছে এটা একটা ডিস্টর্শন by the way you didn't talk about the other distortion which is the protective tariffs that are so high that prices in the domestic market are significantly above international prices, and so that creates another distortion and discourages exports. Part only but I'm sure, but he acknowledges it's in the report. Which protective and high tariffs issue বাজারে দামটা একটু বেশি এবং export prices issue বাজারে ঠিক কম তার ফলে হয় কি এক্সপোর্টে ডিসকারেজ করা হয় মানে ডিসইনসেন্টিভ এই জিনিসটা উনি স্বীকার করে উনি রিপোর্টে লিখে আছে আচ্ছা সেটা সো বিজনেস এনভায়রনমেন্টে উনি এসব কথাগুলো বলে গেছেন একটা ডুয়ালিজমের উত্থাপন করছেন এটা এই ডুয়ালিজমটা হচ্ছে যে এই যে যতগুলো এনাকে এগুলি ইউ ডিসক্রাইব দেম অ্যাজ ফ্রন্টিয়ার ফার্মস মানে যেসব ফ্রন্টিয়ার ফার্ম মানে খুব হাই ফ্লাইং ফার্মস আছে এগুলোর ওনারা বলছেন যে 75% of revenue generate করেন এবং 70% of expenditures are এইসব 70% of exports এবং 75% of revenues এইসব frontier firm মানে বড় ফার্ম গুলো থেকে আসে কিন্তু এমপ্লয়মেন্ট এগুলো মাত্র 15%। এখানে আমার একটা প্রশ্ন থাকবে যে ম্যানুফ্যাকচারিং সেক্টরে যে there are export oriented firms and there are firms that are catering to the domestic market. latest numbers show that export-oriented firms are now more than 50% of the manufacturing sector. So are they generating less employment versus the manufacturing industries that are catering to the domestic market? This is one aspect, perhaps your research can tell us. So, উনি শেষের বক্তব্য রেখেছেন that trade reform মনে করেন যে essential এবং উনি বলতেছেন যে মানে deregulation যেটা আমরা মিনিস্ট্রি অফ ফাইন্যান্স এবং নতুন অর্থমন্ত্রীর কাছ থেকে শুনছি deregulation এবং liberalization ওনারা প্রমোট করছেন এবং ওনার বক্তব্য তাই আসছে যে এটা করতে হবে। Reform priorities আমরা সবাই যে কথা বলছি যে রেভিনিউ আমাদের যে ট্যাক্স জিডিপি রেশিও বর্তমানে দেখা যাচ্ছে 7% এর মধ্যে জিডিপি। ওনারা বলছেন যে 7% যদি ট্যাক্স জিডিপি রেশিও হয় কিন্তু ট্যাক্স এক্সপেন্ডিচার যেটা মানে এক্সামশন ওনারা বলতেছে 6.5%, which is an estimate that আমরাও মনে করি that's okay. So বিশেষ করে I might suggest that in the case of VAT, the VAT collection is about 2.8% of GDP, but the exemptions in VAT are 3.5% of GDP. So I think ওনারা agree করেন যে VAT এর সবচেয়ে বেশি base expansion করার scope আছে. So and that is correct কারণ এবং VAT মানে রিফর্মটা আসতে হবে বিশেষ করে যে ক্রেডিট মেকানিজম যেটা ইনপুট ক্রেডিট মেকানিজম যেটা আছে ভ্যাটে এটাকে শক্তিশালী করতে হবে, এটাকে মোর এফেক্টিভ করতে হবে। সো ভ্যাটে রেভিনিউ জেনারেশনের স্কোপটা সবচেয়ে বেশি, এটা ওনারা স্বীকার করছে এবং সাজেস্ট করছে। আচ্ছা, এক্সটার্নাল সেক্টরে ওনাদের যে বক্তব্য দিয়েছেন এখানে রেমিটেন্স নিয়ে ওনাদের কিছু মানে কনসার্ন আছে যে এটা বর্তমানে ভালো মানে রেকর্ড লেভেলের রেমিটেন্স আসছে। ওনারা মনে করেন যে ইনসেন্টিভ সিস্টেম আছে রেমিটেন্স এক্সচেঞ্জ রেট বর্তমানে স্টেবল আছে এবং যে ইয়েটা আছে যে আপনার স্ক্র্যাপ মার্কেট এবং ব্যাংক রেট এটার মধ্যে যে ডিফারেন্সটা অনেক কম আছে। এটা encourages remittance going in through the official channel. But আরেকটা জিনিস আমরা বলছি যে রেমিটেন্স যে 2.5% যে ইনসেন্টিভ আছে এটাও কাজ করছে ওখানে। I would like to suggest that the exchange rate depreciation that has taken place since 2022 of about 30 to 40%, that is itself an incentive for remittance to flow in through the official channel. So, and I personally would, be a bit, I would reserve my point on that one, that this 2.5% incentive, I don't think it's even necessary because you've got already a 30-40%, incentive from the depreciation. এরপরে আরো 2.5% দেওয়াটা কি ঠিক কিনা এটা একটা আমাদের প্রশ্ন আছে। On the banking sector, এটা they have a point. এখানে সবাই কিন্তু এনপিএল যে খুব বেশি এটা নিয়ে বেশি আলোচনা হয়। এনপিএল যে 30% আছে এখন সেটা উনি যেটা বলছেন আরেকটা বিষয় আমাদের একটু দেখা উচিত মানে ব্যাংকিং সেক্টরে, সেটা হচ্ছে আন্ডার ক্যাপিটালাইজেশন। উনি মনে করেন যে এই যে এনপিএল তো সমস্যা আছে কিন্তু আরেকটা বড় সমস্যা হচ্ছে যে ব্যাংকস আর আন্ডার ক্যাপিটালাইজ। স্ট্যান্ডার্ড হচ্ছে যে অ্যাটলিস্ট 10% মানে ক্যাপিটালাইজেশন হওয়া দরকার আছে, কিন্তু বাংলাদেশের ক্ষেত্রে 3.5 to 4% আছে। সো এইখানে ব্যাংকিং রিফর্মের কিছু কাজ আছে যে ক্যাপিটাল ব্যাংকের ক্যাপিটালকে বাড়ানো দরকার আছে। সো this is one area that they're talking about মানে অ্যাকশন যেখানে দরকার আছে। poverty সম্পর্কে ওনারা বলছে যে পভার্টিটা বেড়ে গেছে, যেখানে 2018 সালে 18.7% যেটা ছিল, এখন কত 1.4 million, মানে 1.4 million additional people have fallen into poverty. তারপরে পভার্টিটা ইনক্রিজ করে 24% চলে গেছে। এটার কারণ অবশ্য ইনফ্লেশন ইজ ডেফিনেটলি ওয়ান অফ দ্য রিজনস, এবং আনএমপ্লয়মেন্ট ইজ দি আদার, এগুলো আছে। পার্টিকুলারলি আমরা মনে করছি যে 2017 সালের পর থেকে মানে এই আনএমপ্লয়মেন্ট এবং জব ক্রিয়েশনের অভাব খুব বেশি দেখা যাচ্ছে। এবং ইন্টারেস্টিংলি ওনাদের একটা বক্তব্য হচ্ছে যে এগ্রিকালচারে যত জব ক্রিয়েশন হয়েছে কৃষিতে হয়েছে, যেখানে দিস ইজ এ ডিপার্চার ফ্রম দ্য স্টাইলাইজড ফ্যাক্ট, হুইচ ইজ এগ্রিকালচার থেকে মানে লেবার চলে যাওয়ার কথা ইন্ডাস্ট্রিতে, এবং ইন্ডাস্ট্রিতে জব ক্রিয়েশন হওয়ার কথা। ওনারা বলছেন যে 2017 সালের পর থেকে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে agriculture has been creating more jobs, and that's a real concern, because and that is not the stylized facts of development. So there is something going on here. আরেকটা বিষয় যেটা এখানে আমরা I'm a bit concerned about ওনাদের যে জব মানে সরি জিডিপি গ্রোথ রেটের কথা যেটা বলছেন, ওনাদের এখনো হিসাব হচ্ছে 3.9% FY 2026 এর expected, ওনাদের estimated GDP growth 3.9 আছে, কিন্তু BPS অলরেডি একটা প্রভিশনাল এস্টিমেট করেছে 2026 এর, ওই এস্টিমেটে দেখা যাচ্ছে 3.5%। তো বিশ্ব ব্যাংকের তাহলে হিসাবটা এখন BBS এর চেয়ে বেশি। BBS এখন কেউ কিন্তু BBS কে চাপ দিচ্ছে না যে তোমরা বাড়িয়ে দেখাও। সো ওনাদের হিসাবে মানে BBS এর চেয়ে কিন্তু গ্রোথ রেট একটু বেশি, 3.9% versus BBS এর এস্টিমেট হচ্ছে 3.5।
3.9 for this fiscal year
Yeah.
26,
Right.
3.5 for last
Year,
BBS at
25.
3.5
BBS এর 3.9 আছে,
BBS at 3.5 is for last year, not this year.
2025,
Yes.
yes, 2025 is 3.5।
Their 3.9 is for fiscal year 26.
BBS একটা প্রভিশনাল এস্টিমেট এখন
That I didn't see.
but you said that under the equation, okay, PBS is not out with the 2026. ওরা ওই আগে যেটা 5% বলে রেখেছিল ওখানেই আছে, এখন তাহলে চেস করে দিন। ওকে, তো PBS এখনো ওদের 5% ধরে রেখেছে এখন পর্যন্ত, নতুন এস্টিমেট এই মাসে আসার কথা আছে। So we will all watch the number, but World Bank has come up with 3.9% for 20, but that's your projection. Okay, fine. So এখানে এখন আছে, আর ওনারা ফিসকাল পলিসি এবং মনিটারি পলিসি যে সমস্যাগুলো ওইগুলো হাইলাইট করা হচ্ছে এখানে। মানে ফিসকাল পলিসি মেইন কনসার্ন হচ্ছে যে ফিসকাল স্পেসটা আমাদের খুব লিমিটেড, এটা আমরা অনেক বলছি, ওনারাও এগ্রি করে ফিসকাল স্পেস আমাদের বেশি কিছু নাই। সেখানে রেভিনিউ মোবিলাইজেশন পার্ট অফ the economic reforms that the government has to undertake, মানে রেভিনিউ মোবিলাইজেশন। তো সবাই আমরা এই করছে অনেক আলোচনা। তো এটা মানে ওনাদের কি টেক অ্যাওয়েজ ওনার প্রেজেন্টেশন থেকে আমি এগুলো বলতে পারি, আরো আছে, তো এগুলো আমরা আলোচনার মধ্যে এটা আসবে। সো আমি এবার আমাদের ডিস্টিংগুইশ প্যানেলিস্টের কাছে যাই ওনাদের বক্তব্য রাখার জন্য। প্রথমে আমি ইনভাইট করবো ডিস্টিংগুইশ প্যানেলিস্ট ডক্টর ফাহমিদা খাতুন, এক্সিকিউটিভ ডাইরেক্টর সেন্টার ফর পলিসি ডায়ালগ। ডক্টর ফাহমিদা কিন্তু এখন she's a very popular commentator, an analyst on the Bangladesh economy. So let us hear from the Farmida. Keep on it, but it's challenges for him.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Zaidi, for inviting them to talk about the report, and also for the kind introduction. You always highlight what I'm not. Thank you. Anyway, I think the report and the presentation have been self-explanatory. It is so vast, and Dr. Sharma has discussed it in great detail. And after that, I think there's nothing much to add. What I can do is that I can just reflect on a few issues which I'm afraid may be repetitive to many of you. So, I just speak working Bangla and English. So, focus report mainly to Tara World বিশ্ব Bank Bangladesh economic update or Bangladesh development update the focus of this report is very important. That is a business environment that delivers job. And as you know, for the last few years, World Bank has been emphasizing on jobs because at the end of the day, economic prosperity is achieved through gainful employment of the labor force of a country. So সেজন্যই এখানে এই রিপোর্টের মধ্যে আমরা দেখলাম যে বাংলাদেশের সামষ্টিক অর্থনীতির একটা বিস্তারিত চিত্র তুলে ধরা হয়েছে। সেখানে দারিদ্র, বৈষম্য, প্রবৃদ্ধি এবং বিজনেস ক্লাইমেট এবং বিনিয়োগ পরিবেশ এবং কর্মসংস্থানের চ্যালেঞ্জ সেগুলো তুলে ধরা হয়েছে। এবং যে রিপোর্টটা থেকে যেটা আমার কাছে আছে, I have already gone through it. So reported মূল মেসেজটা has been to my mind. It's like so what Bangladesh needs is a transition from a growth model which is driven largely by low cost labor and protected domestic structures towards a more productive, diversified, competitive and employment intensive economy. So আমাদের যে গ্রোথ মডেলটা এতদিন পর্যন্ত ছিল চলে এসেছে, এখনো আছে, যে এমপ্লয়মেন্ট প্রথমত নাই, দ্বিতীয়ত যে এমপ্লয়মেন্ট গুলো আছে সেই এমপ্লয়মেন্ট গুলোর কোয়ালিটি খুব পুয়ার, ইনফর্মালিটি অনেক বেশি এবং লো পেইড, তারপরে হচ্ছে যে সিজনালিটি, আন্ডার এমপ্লয়মেন্ট এগুলো বেশি। এবং তারপরে আছে যে সমস্ত বিজনেস এবং কারখানা ব্যক্তি খাত গড়ে উঠেছে, অনেক ক্ষেত্রে দেখা গেছে যে অনেক প্রোটেক্টেড ভাবে তাদেরকে প্রোটেকশন দেওয়া হয়েছে, which is good. I mean, when a sector develops, তখন যেটা আমরা ইনফ্যান্ট ইন্ডাস্ট্রি আর্গুমেন্টের কথা বলি যে তখন একটা গভর্নমেন্ট সাপোর্ট প্রয়োজন পড়ে, but then that kind of support continues forever. তো এখানে তারা বলেছেন, ডক্টর শর্মাও তার বক্তব্যে বলেছেন যে সানসেট ক্লজ থাকা দরকার এবং আফটার এ ওয়াইল এগুলো protection or protective measures should expire so that the other sectors can develop. So এরকম একটা গ্রোথ মডেল এর মধ্য দিয়ে আমরা এসেছি। যদিও অনেক লম্বা সময় ধরে আমাদের প্রবৃদ্ধি অনেক ভালো স্পেকটাকুলার হয়েছে এবং আমাদের দক্ষিণ এশিয়ার দেশ কিংবা স্বল্পোন্নত দেশের মধ্যে বাংলাদেশের প্রবৃদ্ধি একটা প্রশংসিত জায়গায় পৌঁছেছে এবং তার পাশাপাশি সোশ্যাল কিছু প্রোগ্রেসও হয়েছে, সামাজিকভাবে শিশু মৃত্যু হার, মাতৃমৃত্যুর হার, শিক্ষার এনরোলমেন্ট এগুলো বেড়েছে। বাট দেখা যাচ্ছে যে তারপরে একটা জায়গায় এসে সেটা আর সাস্টেনেবল হয়নি, বিকজ এখানে ইনহেরেন্ট কিছু দুর্বলতা। এবং আপনার যে এখানে একটা টেবিল আছে এই প্রেজেন্টেশনের যে 13 পাতায়, এই টেবিলের মধ্যে যে সূচকগুলি সেখানে দেখবেন যে 2023 সাল থেকে কিংবা তারও আগে আমরা দেখছি যে 22 থেকেও কিন্তু অর্থনীতির মূল সূচকগুলো একটা নিচের দিকে ধাবিত হচ্ছে, স্লোইং ডাউন। ওইখান থেকে একটা পর্যায়ে 30 পর্যন্ত যে তারপরে একটু স্লো ডাউন। ওটার একটা কারণ আছে যে আমরা দেখেছি যে কোভিড 2020-21 কোভিডের একটা প্রভাব, তারপরে 22 এসে ইউক্রেন যুদ্ধের প্রভাব, এগুলোর কারণে একটা শক এসেছে তখন আমাদের। এবং তারপরে নিজেদেরও ম্যাক্রো ইকোনমিক্স যে সূচকগুলো, সামষ্টিক অর্থনীতির সূচকগুলো, সেগুলো একটা দুর্বল অবস্থায় পৌঁছেছে, কারণ ভিতরেরও কিছু ইন্টারনাল প্রবলেম গুলো কি কি, যেমন ধরেন যে বেশি এখানে এই প্রেজেন্টেশনেও আছে, রিপোর্টের মধ্যে আরো বিস্তারিত আছে যে বিভিন্ন খাতের পারফরমেন্স গুলা কি, যেগুলো হচ্ছে ইকোনমিক ড্রাইভার, সেগুলোর কি অবস্থা? ফর এক্সাম্পল ব্যাংকিং খাত একটা অন্যতম। ব্যাংকিং খাত অর্থনীতিতে সম্পদ যোগায়, অর্থ যোগায়, যাতে কিনা ব্যক্তি খাত ছোট বড় সবাই তারা দাঁড়াতে পারে। তো বাংলাদেশের ইতিহাসে, বাংলাদেশের স্বাধীনতার পরেও থেকে আমরা দেখেছি যে যে আমাদের যে একটা পুঁজিপতি শ্রেণী কিংবা ব্যক্তি খাত গড়ে উঠেছে, সেটার পেছনে তো ব্যাংকিং খাতের অবদান ছিল। তাদের এখান থেকে সম্পদ পাচ্ছে, কিন্তু তারপরে আস্তে আস্তে আমরা দেখলাম যে সেখানে যে দুর্বলতা গুলি এসেছে, যার ফলে ব্যাংকিং খাত একটা ভাইব্রেন্ট ব্যক্তি খাতের জন্য যা প্রয়োজন সেটা কিন্তু তারা সরবরাহ করতে পারছে না। অন্যান্য কারণ আছে, বিনিয়োগ স্থবিরতার অন্যান্য কারণ আছে, কিন্তু এখানেও একটা যে accessibility, access to finance at a sustainable rate কিংবা at a rate which is affordable, সেই রকম একটা জায়গায় থেকে কিন্তু ব্যাংকিং খাতটা তার এই ইকোনমির চাহিদাটা পূরণ করতে পারছে না। তো আরো অনেক কারণ আছে, সেগুলো ইত্যাদি কারণে আমরা দেখলাম যে আসলে এই যে প্রবৃদ্ধির একটা ধারা এবং সামষ্টিক অর্থনীতির যে সূচকগুলো সেগুলো দুর্বলতর হচ্ছে, যার কারণে we have observed the stability of the macroeconomy has weakened over the years. এবং তারপরে হচ্ছে যে ইনফ্লেশন, মূল্যস্ফীতি আরেকটা কারণ, এবং ইনফ্যাক্ট সেখানেও যদি আপনি ধারাটা দেখেন যে এখানে শুরু হয়েছে সেই 23 সাল থেকে কিন্তু উপরের দিক থেকে, এর আগে 5-6% কিন্তু ছিল, তারপরে 9 থেকে আস্তে আস্তে ডাবল ডিজিটে পৌঁছে গেছে, এইরকম একটা অবস্থায়। তো এই প্রেক্ষিতে গ্রোথ নিয়ে যেটা আমরা বলতে পারি যে আমাদের গ্রোথ যেটা হয়েছিল সেই গ্রোথটা কিন্তু টেকসই হয়। তো মূল চ্যালেঞ্জটা হচ্ছে যে গ্রোথকে কিভাবে টেকসই, একদিকে আমরা গ্রোথের মধ্যে মোহগ্রস্ত হয়েছিলাম, কিন্তু গ্রোথটা টেকসই করার ব্যাপারে সেটা খুব একটা নজর দেওয়া হয়নি। টেকসই করতে হলে যে অর্থনীতির যে অন্যান্য ভিত্তিগুলো, সেখানে ট্রেড পলিসি, রেভিনিউ কালেকশন, ব্যাংকিং খাতের কথা বললাম, তারপরে হচ্ছে এনার্জি সিকিউরিটি, এই সমস্ত ইনফ্রাস্ট্রাকচার, এগুলোকে দিকে আমরা নজর দিই। তো যার কারণে গ্রোথের নেচারটা কি হয়েছে, গ্রোথের নেচারটা হয়েছে যে জবলেস গ্রোথ, এক ধরনের কর্মসংস্থান বিহীন একটা আমরা গ্রোথের একটা চিত্র দেখতে পেয়েছি। এবং এখনো পর্যন্ত আমরা যে দেখছি যে অর্থনীতির যে স্থবিরতা, বিশেষ করে প্রবৃদ্ধি যে নিম্নগামী হয়েছে, তার পিছনে অন্যতম একটা কারণ হচ্ছে যে ব্যক্তি খাতের বিনিয়োগ বাড়ছে না। এটা আগের থেকেই স্ট্যাগনেন্ট কিংবা খুব কম হয়েছিল। জিডিপি 23-24% মধ্যে ব্যক্তি খাতের বিনিয়োগ আটকে ছিল। যে বিনিয়োগটা বেড়েছে সেটা মূলত কিন্তু এই পাবলিক সেক্টর ড্রিভেন বিনিয়োগ, কিন্তু পাবলিক সেক্টর ড্রিভেন বিনিয়োগ দিয়ে তো অর্থনীতিতে আসলে কর্মসংস্থান সৃষ্টি করা যায় না। কর্মসংস্থানের জন্য ব্যক্তি খাতের বিনিয়োগ দরকার। তো সেই ব্যক্তি খাতের বিনিয়োগের ক্ষেত্রে এখানে ডক্টর শর্মা তার প্রেজেন্টেশনে বলেছেন, রিপোর্টেও বিস্তারিত আছে, যে এই যে আমাদের যে কনফিডেন্স, বিজনেস ডেভেলপমেন্টের ক্ষেত্রে, বিজনেসের ক্ষেত্রে কনফিডেন্স, আর এটা উনি বলেছেন যে বিজনেস রেডি, বি রেডি ইন্ডেক্স, সেখানেও কিন্তু আমাদের যে একটা দুর্বল অবস্থা দেখতে পাচ্ছি। এবং পরিষ্কারভাবে কয়েকটা বাধার কথা এখানে বলা হয়েছে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে রেগুলেটরি আনসার্টেনিটি, পলিসি আনপ্রেডিক্টেবিলিটি, বিউরোক্রেটিক ডিলেজ, উইক ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল সেক্টর গভর্নেন্স এবং ইনঅ্যাডিকুয়েট ইনস্টিটিউশনাল এফিসিয়েন্সি, এই কারণগুলো কিন্তু এই রিপোর্টের মধ্যে বলা হয়েছে। এবং এখন একটা আমরা অবস্থায় আছি যে খারাপ থেকে স্ট্যাগনেন্ট ইনভেস্টমেন্ট, স্ট্যাগনেন্ট থেকে এখন মনে হচ্ছে যেন এক নেতিবাচক দিকে চলে যাবে। তো এখানে এখন অনেকেই, আপনি যদি প্রাইভেট সেক্টরকে জিজ্ঞাসা করেন, তখন তারা বলবে যে ইনস্টেড অফ, মানে তাদেরকে যে তারা কি এক্সপ্যান্ড করতে চাচ্ছে, তারা বলবে যে এক্সপ্যান্ড তো দূরের কথা, তারা এখন কিভাবে সার্ভাইভ করবে সেই সার্ভাইভাল স্ট্র্যাটেজিটা নিয়ে কিন্তু ব্যস্ত আছে। তো এইরকম একটা অবস্থা যখন থাকে একটা ইকোনমি, তখন আমরা কতখানি এক্সপেক্ট করতে পারি ইকোনমিতে। সো দ্যাট ইজ দ্য ইস্যু নাও। এবং সেটা আসলে আরো মাল্টিপ্লাইড হয়েছে বিকজ অফ দ্য জিওপলিটিক্যাল সিচুয়েশন, বিকজ অফ দ্য মিডল ইস্ট ক্রাইসিস। এখন যেটা আমাদের অর্থনীতি তাদের এটার সাথে খুবই ওতপ্রোতভাবে জড়িত। বাংলাদেশের অর্থনীতি ওভার দ্য ইয়ার্স হ্যাভ বিন ইন্টিগ্রেটেড উইথ দ্য গ্লোবাল ইকোনমি, এবং যার কারণে আমরা এক্সপোর্ট, ইম্পোর্ট, ইনভেস্টমেন্ট, ফরেন ইনভেস্টমেন্ট ইত্যাদি, রেমিটেন্স ইত্যাদির মাধ্যমে যুক্ত রয়েছি। এটা ভালো দিক যেমন আছে, সেটা খারাপ দিকও আছে। যখন ভালো হয় ও পৃথিবীর ইকোনমি, গ্লোবাল ইকোনমি, তখন সেটার বেনিফিট আমরা চাইলে নিতে পারি। কিন্তু যখন খারাপ হয় তখন আমরা কিন্তু এফেক্টেড হই, যার কারণে মিডল ইস্টের থেকে আমরা যে ফিউল ইম্পোর্ট করে থাকি, সো যার কারণে আমাদের এটা বাধাগ্রস্ত হচ্ছে। এবং দুটা কারণে, একটা তো হচ্ছে এই জ্বালানি ইম্পোর্ট, আরেকটা হচ্ছে রেমিটেন্স। তো এই দুটাই কিন্তু আমাদের অর্থনীতির একটা স্তম্ভ। তো এই ক্রাইসিসটা এখন মাল্টিপ্লাইড, প্রি এক্সিস্টিং প্রবলেমস have been multiplied with the current geo-economic crisis or geopolitical crisis, you can say as well. So এইরকম অবস্থা এখানে উনি শেষের দিকে অনেকগুলি রিকমেন্ডেশন করেছেন। আমি অন্য বিষয়ের সমস্যার কথা আমরা যাচ্ছি না এখন। ফর এক্সাম্পল, যে এখন বাজেট আসছে, বাজেট আসতে গিয়ে আমাদের যে অনেক এক্সপেকটেশন থাকে, এবং এই গভর্নমেন্ট যেমন নতুন এসেছেন তাদের এবং এইরকম একটা ইকোনমিকে তারা ফেস করতে হচ্ছে, কিন্তু এবং তার পাশাপাশি তাদেরকে একটা বাজেটও দিতে হচ্ছে। তো বাজেটে মানুষের এক্সপেকটেশন বেশি, হয়তো নতুন গভর্নমেন্ট হিসেবে তারা হয়তো নতুন কিছু দেখতেও চাইবে, কিন্তু একটা লিমিটেশন, একটা তাদের কনস্ট্রেইন হচ্ছে যে টাকা কোথায়, ফিজিক্যাল স্পেস কোথায়, ওয়ের ইজ দ্য ফিজিক্যাল স্পেস। আমরা দেখছি যে রিপোর্টেও আছে, আমরা জানি যে আমাদের ট্যাক্স জিডিপি রেশিও 2025-এ মাত্র 6.8% ছিল। ওভার দ্য ইয়ার্স এটাও কিন্তু একটা নিচের দিকে ডিক্লাইনিং ট্রেন্ড, ওয়ান অফ দ্য লোয়েস্ট ইন দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড। তো এরকম অবস্থায় তারা যে সমস্ত অ্যাম্বিশন গুলো, এবং আমাদের নট অনলি অ্যাম্বিশন, রিকোয়ারমেন্ট, বেসিক রিকোয়ারমেন্ট, জব ক্রিয়েশন, ইনভেস্টমেন্ট ইমপ্রুভমেন্ট, সোশ্যাল প্রোটেকশন, সোশ্যাল সেফটি নেট, পভার্টি বেড়ে যাচ্ছে, ইনইকুয়ালিটি বেড়ে যাচ্ছে। ওইগুলোর জন্য যে পরিমাণটা অর্থ দরকার, সেই অর্থটা তো আমার নাই। এবং কি করতে হবে, হয় আমার ডোমেস্টিক সোর্স থেকে বড় করতে হবে, না হলে বাইরে থেকে। এবং আমরা দেখছি যে বড় করার ফলে এখানে কিন্তু আপনার এই যে ডেট অ্যাজ এ পার্সেন্টেজ অফ জিডিপি, সেটাও কিন্তু বেড়ে যাচ্ছে। 2000 আমরা একটা অনেকদিন পর্যন্ত 37-38-এর মধ্যে ছিলাম, 2025-এ এটা 39.5। তো ওনাদের প্রজেকশন হচ্ছে যে এটা আরো বাড়তে থাকবে আগামী বছরগুলি। 26-এ প্রায় 42%, তারপরে আরো 44-46%। সুতরাং ডেট বাড়তে থাকবে। So that is not bad as such, but the country has to have the capacity to repay the debt. সেটাই তো আমাদের নাই। আমাদের এক্সপোর্ট যে একটা রোবাস্ট গ্রোথ হচ্ছে, সেখানে একটা দুর্বলতা দেখা যাচ্ছে। ডোমেস্টিক রিসোর্সের কথা বললাম, তো গভর্নমেন্টকে বড় করতে হচ্ছে ব্যাংকিং সেক্টর থেকে, এবং কোনো কোনো সময় এমনকি কেন্দ্রীয় ব্যাংক থেকেও করতে হয়, যেটা কিনা আনসাস্টেইনেবল। ওই রকম একটা সিচুয়েশনে আসলে যে চ্যালেঞ্জগুলি গভর্নমেন্টের সামনে আসছে, তো সেই চ্যালেঞ্জের গুলি দূর করার জন্য আসলে বিটস এন্ড পিস, এখানে বাজেট তৈরির জন্য এখানে থেকে সরিয়ে ওখানে যোগ বিয়োগ করে, সেটা আসলে সাময়িক সমাধান। একটা স্থিতিশীল, একটা টেকসই সমাধানের জন্য যেটা দরকার, সেটা হচ্ছে মূল বিষয় হচ্ছে রিফর্ম, সংস্কার, প্রাতিষ্ঠানিক সংস্কার, সুশাসনের সংস্কার, লেবার মার্কেটের সংস্কার, সমস্ত সংস্কারগুলির দিকে, এবং মূল আরো ট্রেড পলিসির ক্ষেত্রে, ট্রেডের ক্ষেত্রে সংস্কার, সেটাও উনিও জোর দিয়েছেন। উনি একটা বিষয় যে বাংলাদেশের যে ট্রেডের ক্ষেত্রে, ডক্টর জাইদি সরকার ইজ এ স্পেশালিস্ট, হি নোজ ইট অল। সেটা হচ্ছে যে এই ট্রেডের ক্ষেত্রে আমাদের যে একটা প্রোটেকশনিজম, একটা আমরা কিন্তু সাটল ভাবে যদিও মুখে বলি যে ওপেন মার্কেট ইকোনমি, অল অফ দিস, বাট there has been a protectionist approach towards the whole issue. But আমরা ওইখানেও বেশি দিন থাকতে পারবো না, বিকজ আমরা এখন ডিসি থেকে গ্রাজুয়েশন করতে যাচ্ছি। এই যে তার মানে হচ্ছে যে আমাদের হোল ক্যারিফ স্ট্রাকচারটা ডিক্যালিব্রেট করতে হবে। এই যে নন রেসিপ্রোসিটি মেজার, অর্থাৎ কিনা আমি অন্য দেশের বাজারে যাব, শুল্ক মুক্ত প্রবেশ চাইবো, আবার অন্যরা যখন আমাদের দেশে আসবে তখন আমি ট্যারিফ বসাবো, এই পদ্ধতি আর চলবে না। তো গ্রাজুয়েট করার পরে আমি যা পাবো সেটা কিন্তু অন্যকেও দিতে হবে, তখন একটা বিরাট সমস্যা হবে। আমাদের যে ট্যাক্স স্ট্রাকচার এখন, যেটা কিনা ইনডিরেক্ট ট্যাক্সের উপরে ডিপেন্ডেন্ট, সেইখানে বড় একটা ধাক্কা। সেটার জন্য একটা সংস্কার দরকার। প্রত্যেকটা ক্ষেত্রে এই সংস্কারের উপরে খুব গুরুত্ব দিতে হবে, এবং এই রিপোর্টে যথাযথভাবে শেষের দিকে উনি শর্ট টার্ম প্রায়োরিটিজ এবং তারপরে রিফর্ম প্রায়োরিটিস এর কথা বলেছেন, which are really really critical for the Bangladesh economy going forward. Thank you very much.
Excellent and very comprehensive review of keynote presentation. এবং আপনার কাছ থেকে আমরা নতুন কিছু সমাধান এবং প্রস্তাব পেয়েছি কি কোথায় রিফর্ম করার প্রয়োজন আছে। What is music to my ears that you also agree that আমাদের trade policy টা অত্যন্ত সংকুচিত মানে more very restrictive and এটা open করার মানে টাইম এসে গেছে। otherwise এই যে আমরা ফ্রি ট্রেড এগ্রিমেন্ট করার যে চেষ্টা করা হচ্ছে, অনেক সময় শুনি যে 20টা দেশের সাথে 26টা দেশের সাথে আমাদের ফ্রি ট্রেড এগ্রিমেন্ট, but at the first step হচ্ছে যে free trade agreement means trading without tariffs. You have to move to somewhere around 5% tariff level is there. We are at 28% at the nominal tariff level and 55% plus at the total trade tax there. Okhane থেকে কি করে free trade agreement করবো with not with some African countries but developed countries South Korea সাথে এখন কথা হচ্ছে free trade agreement করার কথা, but the first step is to get the tariffs down at a level যেখানে you can start the negotiation, but we're not in that position to even start here. I wish I could, translate all of the things, but she generally agrees with all the findings. And one of the things she said, this growth rate, the growth rate is we never tried to make it sustainable. It should have been made sustainable, and we had this situation of jobless, which is what your analysis of this. The jobless growth is already challenging, job creating growth with that. So I think will be our last panelist. So we now go to Mr. Noor Kabir from the Foreign Investors Chamber.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, PRI Chairman, for our think tank and also our members. And I'd like to appreciate Mr. Sharma or Dr. Sharma the way he has actually presented his paper, especially the timely outcome of the paper is that when Bangladesh government is critically analyzing the current economic situation and what is the path for their development and growth and other things. And as Dr. Zaidi Sattar and Honorable Executive Director of CPD, our Famida Dr. Famida, has very nicely, very eloquently described the whole paper. If I like to start it, there will be a lot of duplications, but I like to highlight few things. He has segregated different areas of challenges and started with the key messages that the growth challenge. But one of the issue that I like to highlight that tax GDP ratio, we all are talking about that. Last few years, we don't have any foreign investment in the country. Not a significant, not insignificant, not any. From the foreign investors, Chamber of Commerce, we are very concerned about that, and we are trying to find out the reason. কেন আমাদের দেশে ফরেন ইনভেস্টমেন্ট আসা কমে যাচ্ছে? এর অন্যতম একটা কারণ আমরা বের করেছি, আমরা একটা রিসার্চও করেছি। তার একটা বড় কারণ হচ্ছে ফিসক্যাল পলিসি। A fiscal policy এবং taxation policy which is unpredictable and very unpredictable because any business coming to the economy, they wanted to see their long-term vision. That means they want to see that 10 years down the line, what is the government policy, how they will run their business. But that is unpredictable because when any of the investment coming to the country, after 2 years, there will be a new policy which is hindering or I must say losing their confidence. That need to be addressed. And then another issues that he has mentioned in his report very clearly about the foreign exchange for exchange and the inflations and the other economic indicators all are in the downtrend, all are in the critical line. How we can actually move forward? That Zaidi has mentioned that new government is actually, especially the finance minister is always talking about cost of doing business and ease of doing business. It is his buzzword right now. He's also emphasizing on that. That if we really want to focus on cost of doing business should be affordable level and it is attractable for the business community, then have to address some areas that Dr. Famida had already mentioned, some of the areas that where, and report also mentioned that these are the areas that has to be addressed. But problem is our financial sector, banking sector, and other sectors all are in a vulnerable situation. To make them in a track, it is a very, very tough role for the current government. And if that can be in the track, and finance minister mentioned in the last meeting, you were there, that he need 2 years time to turn around. But 2 years is really a long time, but condition of the current economic indicators spelled out that yes, it is not an overnight change situation. It needs some area of attention. And other area, as Dr. Famida also mentioned, that budget is coming, everybody is looking into, the new government is 3 months running and they are going to announce a new budget, which is very important for the current situation of the Bangladesh. And we are really concerned from the business community that what is coming on, because we have been looking for many companies. They are really concerned for their growth. For example, I can give you one example. The company, they are supposed to invest new extension of a business and a huge amount, few million. But all of a sudden, NBR has imposed supplementary duty of 20% on that product. But they have calculated that if that investment সেটা যদি হয় তাহলে employment বাড়বে, revenue বাড়লে গভর্নমেন্টের ট্যাক্সও বাড়বে. But unfortunately, we could not convince NBR yet. So that means that foreign investors from the headquarters said, if the country like this, they don't understand the growth and potentiality that we have to invest. So we don't need to invest. So this is, I'm sharing very frankly about the current situation and we have to address those. This is an piecemeal issues. There are a lot more issues among the business communities and the others, because indicators will coming up based on their business and investment activities. Their confidence is very important and consistency is important. I repeatedly said, and also predictability. So I think that's all, because other things very, very nicely mentioned. I can repeat it, but this is almost saying that. Thank you once again for giving the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nur Kabir, Secretary General of the Foreign Investment Chamber. আমি আবার ভাষণ করে দিচ্ছি আমার কলিগ ডক্টর খুশির আলমের কাছে।
Are you recording or?
No, not
Okay.
recording.
Okay.
To invite
Okay.
next.
Okay, Ashik, you take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for your presentation. I think we went over these topics for last 1 year, almost last 1 year. And the broad message is the same. I think I keep saying this, that if you look at the long-term growth trajectory of Bangladesh, something new is happening. From 1972 to 2019, we see the growth trend. The average growth was increasing and growth volatility was reducing. From 2019, if you move forward, the average growth is falling and growth volatility has been rising. Now, এই যে প্রবৃদ্ধির অস্থিরতাটা যেটা বেড়েছে বা প্রবৃদ্ধি যেটা কমেছে, we have to ask, is this a blip or is this a new normal, right? And this is where I think academics have to invest their intellectual capacity. Because what we see is that this is not happening just because there were repeated external shocks from 2019. Yes, that has been a primary reason. 2019, 2022, 2024, shocks have become a new normal, and then the tariff uncertainties. But we have also created internal problems. We have a fiscal fracture, which I don't want to go into. You have covered it very well. We have a financial sector fracture, which also is embedded within our political economy reality. And we also have a power crisis. Now, given this, you have correctly said that the cushion is weak for the economy. The cushion is very weak for the economy. And I think this needs kind of like a broken radio. We have to keep saying it now, that reform is not an optional policy choice anymore. It is a necessity. বাংলাদেশের অর্থনীতি যেখানে দাঁড়িয়েছে, সেখানে অর্থ খাতের সংস্কার, রাজস্ব খাতের সংস্কার আর অপশনাল চয়েস নয়। আমরা অর্থনৈতিক যুক্তিতে বাধ্য এখন এই সংস্কারগুলো করার জন্য। And if we avoid this reform, many countries in the world, I don't want to be an alarmist, but what we risk is a middle income trap. অর্থনৈতিক সংস্কারগুলোকে যদি আমরা না করি, অন্যান্য দেশ যেভাবে মিডল ইনকাম ট্র্যাপে পড়েছে, আমাদেরও সেই মিডল ইনকাম ট্র্যাপে পড়ার একটা সুযোগ আছে। Now, coming back to page 13 of your forecast, you have a forecast of 5.5% GDP growth for fiscal year 28 and a 4.6%. Let me add a bit of caveat: with reform, not without reform. You're saying inflation will go down to 5%. Let me add a caveat: with reform, not without reform. Because without reform, those forecasts are not going to come in play. Now, in terms of these reforms, I think for the last 2 months, there has been a lack of clarity from policymakers. Where is our fiscal reform going? Where is our financial sector reform? And this has created unnecessary tension with development partners. Now, I hope good sense prevails within our policymakers and they commit to these reforms by creating a cooperation with critical development partners such as World Bank, such as IMF, to anchor fiscal discipline, macro discipline. You said something very important: robust macro fundamentals. We have to respect the necessity of robust macro fundamentals. That is a necessary condition for growth. That is not, that is something that you cannot ignore and spend your way to a sustainable growth. We have to kind of keep in mind on that issue. I almost agree with everything that you have said in this presentation, except one. You have said there's a contractionary monetary policy. I don't think we have, for the last 2 months, contractionary monetary policy. I feel because part of our contractionary monetary policy is not just policy rate, which is already very weak in the subcontinental framework. Our real policy rate is lower than India, is lower than Pakistan, is lower than Sri Lanka. Not only that, we have the lowest real policy rate, but if you look at the monetary policy forward guidance, which you appreciated of the last governor, that there was a clear messaging about inflation, there was a clear messaging. For the last 2 months, all the communication that happened on the monetary policy front is about how we will flood the market with loose credit, with credit supply, to wheat farms. Now, these are well intentioned, but this creates confusion concerning how serious we are in terms of mitigating inflation or managing inflation. Because in monetary policy tool, you have few tools: money supply, forward guidance, and the real policy rate. If you use these three tools properly, only then you can contain the inflationary pressure. In terms of poverty, I'll make 2 points and I'll close my remark. In Bangladesh, poverty has not started at that 20% threshold. But there is also a problem of poverty vulnerability. And we say 35% people are vulnerable to poverty because any given shock, they fall into poverty. Now, if you look at the last 20 years of RCT literature, you'll find light on one issue. There was a debate: what is more important, consumption smoothing for the poor or asset transfer, asset formation? And it has emerged through multiple randomized control trials. What really mitigates poverty is if you put people who are vulnerable to poor or poor on the asset ladder. So now social protection, I feel the new government is focused on social protection. I think this is where a lot of engagement needs to happen, is rather than creating consumption smoothing instruments, we must invest time in finding instruments that can put people on the asset ladder. Because what we see, the nature of poverty here is that people are employed in low productivity sector. And when you're employed in the low productivity sector, you depend on only one source of income. Now, in terms of adding more cushion to the ordinary people, it helps if they additionally have a cow or they have an alternate sort of income. And this is what creates the trap. Because to have an asset threshold, you need those micro transfers of 1,000 taka or 2,000 taka that has defined our social policy program is not enough. So if we are serious about addressing poverty alleviation, I think we have to rethink about moving toward that asset transfer policy rather than consumption smoothing policy. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, the free, now it's open for any comments.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving the floor. I'm organizing breaching protocol, but I have a few observations to make. That since time and tide waits for none, I think the concept of AI is conspicuous by its absence in the presentation. The government still getting simple. The Grameen Professor Yunus has proved beyond all shades of doubt that Grameen poor people, they are also banking. The new concept, the American goes on creating concepts around embedded journalism. So you have to be brave enough to face them. And in this context, we all know that in the wake of the Southeast economic meltdown earlier, how did they come through this? The great South Asian economic meltdown, it was negated by reinvestment, which means that the government has no business to interfere in these things. Forgetting the very area, if I'm not mistaken, in the wake of the Southeast Asian economic meltdown, that private sector government has no business, and the public sector has no business in interfering with the private sector. Thank you very much.
Anybody else?
Thank you, Chair. It's a great honor to come and listen to such a nice presentation. It has been welcomed by formal discussions. Actually, as a serving diplomat, and I have been ambassador up to 2022, and since I had experience of serving in both Germany and China, I think one thing was missing. We are giving more emphasis actually on reform, reform, and reform. In my 36 plus year of career as a diplomat, I think now it's time, from the experience of serving Germany and China, I think in addition to reform, you need innovation as well. We should have separate emphasis to be innovative. China did a lot of things. I've served China for a long time, and at the same time, I've visited many businesses and people related to business and economy. They always nowadays give emphasis on something new, to develop something new, innovation, not just reform and reform. We are doing too much reform from 1972. Now for a country which is number 2 after India in the region, when we think about progress and everything, we shouldn't actually only think about, India is not only thinking about reform, we should also go for innovation. Secondly, we should give emphasis on training and specialized training for not just diplomats and some economic officers, all people who are related to business and economy. We are not doing that, and 55 years have passed. I will not go for too many observations because we have other people, they will also have from the younger generation, their say. But from my long experience as a career diplomat, I think with reform, there should be emphasis on innovation, particularly which is applicable for a country like Bangladesh. And for that reason, politicians should ask for them to, support of people who think in that way, in an innovative way. Thank you very much.
Yes.
And I would like to thank Dr. Sharma first for the very comprehensive presentation. I want to bring in one issue here because we're talking about the business environment and the job creations. The issue of sustainability and sustainability transparency within supply chains. Because of these changing regulations globally, I think for the business sector's improvement, this is a very crucial issue that we need to work on, and that is to be included in the reform measures. Now, why this is important is first, it is linked with the international standardization and the responsibility for business practice. And it can be linked with the fiscal measures as well, the tax incentives. Because those who are more compliant, more transparent, they can get tax benefit. And in that case, it can improve the whole business environment. Another is in the FTAs, if we go for FTA with European Union, EU, then the sustainability issue will come in because EU is emphasizing on the CSDD and CSRD. So we need to be prepared, our businesses need to be prepared for that. Because after this graduation, we'll be losing the trade preference. And one thing is about the sustenance of the SMEs. If we want to, we know that a lot of industries, SMEs are closing down. So if we think of the sustenance of the SMEs in future, they need to be more led to practice on these issues on the sustainability reporting and standardization. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for your stimulating presentations.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Kashmir. I'm a research fellow at Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, BIDS. In your page 30, in table 6, you have mentioned there are some selected macroeconomic indicators. And one of the indicators is the debt as percentage of GDP. And we've seen that debt as percentage of GDP is increasing. Currently, according to World Bank, estimate is 41.9%, and it will be 46.3% in fiscal year 2028. So I just want to know, like, what is World Bank's suggestions on the Bangladesh government debt management or debt financing? Thank you.
Anybody else?
This is Shafii Shagar from China 24. As we see that from 2017, the agricultural sector made more jobs than others, and you say that it's concerning. Then why would you think that it's concerning? As we need our food security. So if we need our food security, then the farmers and the others that need to be in agricultural sector. So why it is concerning?
Anyone else? Well, you'll get a chance to later then.
Hello, my question to Dr. Sharma. You
Please
have,
introduce yourself. Introduce yourself.
I'm Joanna Muni, acting president Coca-Cola Bangladesh. My question was, you have presented many challenges for Bangladesh economy, but there is no mention of the people. Lack of human resources, which we are not delivering continuously to have the reform we are continuously discussing. We need more skilled people to understand the problem first. For now, we don't even know what the real problem and how we get over that. But if we don't have people, we might never find the problem and later on find the solution. So I request to have a more detailed analysis on our human resource purpose.
You want to have something? Maybe this is the last one that just try to go because it's already 1 o'clock.
Hello, I'm Tasfiya Akhtar from the Department of Economics, Independent University of Bangladesh. As a researcher and also have been going through projects regarding RMG sector and everything. I had a little query. As we go forward and keeping in mind the LDC graduation in future, which is already delayed, and Dr. Sharma has mentioned that it is high time. We have high time historic incentives are removed and we look into it. However, without solid policy implementation for export diversification, how do we proceed forward? And if so, if we would export diversification actually really change the business environment dynamics of Bangladesh, or would it be actually practical given the current situation of the macroeconomic arena in Bangladesh? Thank you.
Okay, please go ahead. Okay.
Thank you, sir. আমি সৈয়দ রায়হান আমিন, আমি এডিটোরিয়াল অ্যাসোসিয়েট দেশকার জন্য। তো এই এক্সপোর্ট ডাইভার্সিফিকেশন যে কথাটা বললো, আমাদের যদি আরএমজি দেখি আর মানে দুইটা আর কি, আমরা আরএমজি দেখি আর রেমিটেন্স দেখি, এটা যদি নাম্বার 1 2 হয় তাহলে 3 4 কি 3 4 হলে সেটা কত বড়, ওইটা কি এত বড় যে আমি আমার এক্সপোর্ট ডাইভার্সিফাই করতে পারবো। সবসময় তো আমরা এক্সপোর্ট ডাইভার্সিফিকেশনের কথা শুনি, কিন্তু ডাইভার্সিফাই করার মতো বড় এক্সপোর্ট বাস্কেট কি আমার কাছে আছে কিনা, যদি না থাকে সেটার জন্য আমাদের করণীয় কি। তো সেটার ব্যাপারে স্যার আমরা কিছু করতে পারি কিনা, আমরা শুধু তোমরা ডাইভার্সিফিকেশন শুনি, তো করতে পারবো কি ডাইভার্সিফিকেশন?
Okay, I have a few comments, Dhruv, and I'll pass it to, I think Zaidi also has a question. After that, do you want to put the question or I'll just have a few comments on this here? Yes, I'll just
will put a question.
Oh, you want to, okay, then put the question.
Okay, I think this follows from the two questions that preceded subject of export diversification. But it's also a question to Dr. Dhruv Sharma. You know, this issue that agriculture is the one that has created more jobs in the recent time. It's very unusual. That's not as bad as that. So my question to him would be, you know, what kind of growth would you recommend that would be actually more job creating? My understanding is the export-oriented, you know, growth is more job. At least that's the record that we have in Bangladesh. And I think in the other developing countries that have, you know, that have success stories like China, East Asia, and all that. So, and our manufacturing sector is becoming more export-oriented. And right now, the weight of the export-oriented manufacturing is more than 50%. That's all. I have a response to these, export diversification story. The fundamental problem, you're looking for, what is the second? You've got ready-made garments. The second is actually, I would think footwear would be the second ready-made garment. But my point is not that after ready-made garments, we have 1,400, non-garment export products, most of which the volume of export is less than $1 million, and they are not growing. The reason they are not growing is the incentive to export or incentive to expand non-garment export is perverse. I mean, you are incentivized to sell those products because those products are like ready-made garments, they're not 100% export oriented. They have a choice between selling in the domestic market versus exporting. And when they have that choice, the answer is very clear. Export is not profitable compared to domestic market. That is the reason why you don't have any other item even close to ready-made garments. Ready-made garment export is now reaching $40 billion. You don't have, there are 2 or 3 that have reached $1 billion. The rest is nowhere. So our export is ready-made garments so far, and it's not going anywhere in terms of diversification because of the perverse incentive structure that they have. Maybe Dr.
Okay, now I'll just have just a few comments and then I'll pass it to Dhruv and you can respond. First, this whole question of job creation and this one statistics. Small group of farms, 10%, 75% of the revenues, 70% of the exports, and only 15% of the employment. Then the question is, what's the right way to go forward? Because if we are not doing it, but again, as Dr. Sattar is saying that it's a question of exports generating jobs. Is it actually generating jobs? If you look at RMJ, we want RMJ to grow because we need that foreign exchange. So banking on just sectors like that we keep on investing there, but they have to contract because AI and other technology will come in, which will require them to curtail jobs to be productive. Now, jobs have moved to agriculture because they don't have a choice, because they're just underemployed there. This whole question of our development strategy, and one of the numbers you say that since 2016, we have been on the downside. So what was the model that was at that point of time? We are talking of growth. Everybody's hung up on growth. The debate is on growth. The newspapers are full of growth, but not going into the fundamental of the structural deficiency that was building up. And it is a fact that private investments were closing in even before we are making this noise, because as we saw, few business houses or few farms who were at the height of this capital formation, rest of the were fizzling out, and that led to this banking crisis. That has led to the debt crisis in the power sector, energy sector. So just hanging on, just growth and telling of this is how to go. And I think there is a fundamental, we need to really go back and what should be our economic model? Was it right, the one we are following? So Dhruv, look forward to your response.
Very easy question to answer. I'm glad that we're supposed to be breaking very soon, because that limits how much I can say right now about it. But look, let me just do a few of the
very attentive crowd.
Let me just turn to a few of the reflections that were made by everyone. Thank you. I mean, it's interactions like this that also help us understand what people are thinking about, as well as what we should maybe think about when we're producing some of these reports. But at the outset, I'd like to say every few years, the bank produces something along the lines of growth diagnostics. This growth diagnostics identifies binding constraints to growth and what needs to change. So we did one a few years ago. The next one is due. I'm leading that. So I'm hoping to have some level of specificity in terms of answers for you by December. But in the meantime, there are some certain things that, regardless of time, they've been, when our reports are due, these things have been in the public domain for a long time. And I'm going to come back to my point about leveling the playing field, when we talk about diversification, when we talk about Bangladesh moving up the value chain, creating a business environment, a more enabling business environment will resolve some of these issues, right? Weak competition. When you were talking, sir, about innovation, one of the things that drives innovation is competition, right? When you're protected, there's no need to innovate, right? So it's a simple answer, but and there's a lot to unpack there. But as a headline, if you remove, if you create a little bit of pressure to with competition, that will happen. And countries, the ones you mentioned, they've they to a certain extent also supported certain industries, but then also opened them up to competition, which is where that sort of drive to innovate comes from. I mentioned one of the reasons why we're seeing a slowdown in exports over the past year or so is because of intensified competition. That was my point. Some of the top tier firms here in Bangladesh, particularly in the ready-made garment sector, are world class, right? But the rest of them are not. And that's simply because of some of the things you also mentioned. There's this anti-export and anti-diversification bias in trade policy at the moment, right? It creates perverse incentives, which leads to a stagnation of innovation. So this growth model, this idea that, what changed in 2016, I don't think anything changed. It's just the model that was there before. Some of the gains that you had from that model slowly start to evaporate, and that naturally happens. You'll reach a certain stage where you do need to then change and adapt and innovate and move forward. And I think Bangladesh has reached that point, which is why I said, regardless of when Bangladesh eventually ends up graduating and then being exposed to more competition, though that debate began a while ago, and the responses to that debate in the form of policy measures should already be formulated. And firms should start thinking about what might happen, right? And it's like riding a bike, and eventually you have the training wheels, and they'll be needed to be taken off at some point. Otherwise, you will be overtaken because you'll be riding too slow, right? So, access to finance, infrastructure bottlenecks, access to electricity, water, all of these things. I didn't mention them because there was a long list, but these are in the report. These are also issues that need to be looked at. Whenever we speak about why investment has been so poor over the last few years, all firms give us 3 or 4 reasons, right? You can talk about all the distorted tax incentives, lack of transparency. The number one reason over the past few years has been policy uncertainty. Right? Policy uncertainty. You cannot make a long-term decision about what to do with your firm if you don't know the direction of policy. Political uncertainty was another reason. Cost of capital was another reason. And then these power, infrastructure, supply chain challenges. Now, you've had elections. So to a certain extent, I'm hoping at least political uncertainty is gone. So now you're left with some of the other things. Policy uncertainty. My understanding is that the government will be releasing its 5-year plan anytime, maybe even today or tomorrow. So maybe we'll get some
strategic framework.
Strategic framework. Yes, I should be careful here. The 5-year strategic framework, and then you've got a budget coming up in a couple of weeks as well. So hopefully this will lay out some of the steps needed to be taken, which were outlined more broadly in the manifesto that was released around election time, where there was some level of specificity in the direction that the government wants to proceed. When it comes to jobs, there was reference to growing the ICT sector, I think by 2 million jobs with 800,000 freelancers, and so on. And so your point about AI earlier, it wasn't dealt with in this particular report. But the regional report, so we also produce a regional report, which is produced by our regional chief economist. They looked at the impact of AI on the South Asian region. So there's some suggestions about how disruptive AI can be, but also they're looking at it from a perspective of opportunity. So what opportunities are created with AI? Distortions when it comes to trade as well, impacts on trade. policy uncertainty as an issue, and also transparency. When it comes to businesses, transparency when it comes to what rates are being applied, why are they being applied, are they following legal frameworks? All of these affect decisions. The discussion when it comes to investment almost inevitably falls, I think, incorrectly on just monetary costs. It's expensive to borrow, expensive to invest, but all businesses, I think I can say that we've spoken to, will always tell you, no, we can deal with those. We can at least we can plan for those. But when it comes to transparency and policy certainty, it's difficult, and that's what we're facing. Now there was a question about the concern that we have about jobs being created primarily in the agriculture sector. Right. Look, my point here wasn't that these are necessarily bad jobs and that should be the way Bangladesh should go. That would be perfectly fine if those jobs were being created in high productivity sectors, maybe better paying sectors. But actually, the jobs that are being created are in low productivity areas and in with low pay. So if the idea isn't necessarily about Bangladesh creating more jobs, it's also about better jobs. And so the question about food security, I think, is slightly is perhaps not the way we're looking at it. You have issues, dealing with food security. There's one way of doing it, but this job story is not relevant to that in this particular context. Let me come back to there was a question about skills in Bangladesh and whether there's capacity. Look, again, if I take I'll take liberty with what you ask and turn it to a question about what employers are telling us. They're telling us that they're facing a scenario where there's a big skills mismatch because recent entrants into the labor market aren't coming to them with the skills they need or they want to start work on first day, right? There are those who are coming into the workforce who are very good at solving equations or sitting exams really well, but they cannot simply communicate. They can't formulate simple emails or communicate with clients or even internally in a way that means that a lot of the training burden falls in the private sector itself, and they're not equipped to do that at this stage. Right, so there's a big mismatch in what is being demanded in the labor market and what is being supplied. In this growth diagnostics that I was referring to that we're working on, we do have a section on human capital. So we'll have a section where we look at infrastructure capital constraints as well as human capital constraints and what can be done. The objective of that report is actually to keep the analysis, if you like, behind the curtains and come up with policy suggestions. In the past, we've tended to highlight the analytical part a little bit more, but right now, I think the need of the day is to provide the solution more than the analytical. You can always argue about analysis, use this model, use that, do this. But at the end of the day, we need solutions. So we're hoping that we'd be able to provide some specificity to address the human capital story, infrastructure gaps in Bangladesh as well. Look, when it comes to some of the reforms that I spoke about earlier, we spoke about a VAT system perhaps as one of the ways of moving forward when it comes to reforming the VAT system as one of the things that can be done in the shorter term. There are a whole host of medium-term and long-term reforms. The reason we selected VAT is because there's some obvious wins there, and they can be done in a relatively painless way if it's thought out well, right? And what I mean by this is having simply having a simpler and fairer system. Moving to a less. What I mean by simple, I mean you have multiple rates. You have so many truncated rates. You have so many exemptions and so on. There are lessons from other countries which had similar structures and then slowly moved to a bit more of a simpler system. And they resulted in revenue gains and at the same time protected vulnerable households. So there are lessons to take away. the fear always is that if you have, if you simplify or you move towards providing exemptions on certain segments of society, you lose out on revenue. Empirical evidence, international evidence, regional evidence suggests that's not the case. So it's not about reinventing the wheel with some of these things. It's actually seeing what others have done, seeing the similarities and say, okay, this is something that we can tweak and we can do so now and quickly. There was a point about debt. Look, Bangladesh's growth trajectory has slowed, right? I mean, at the end of the day, so it's a simple ratio. So when you move the bottom part of that ratio, of course, your debt to GDP will rise. But beyond that, there is a little bit of a concern there because Bangladesh, so the World Bank and the IMF, we conduct what's called debt sustainability analysis. So when we look at debt, it's not just about the number itself, it's about sustainability of that debt. Debt in itself has negative connotations, but it also has useful purposes when it comes to development, right? So Bangladesh's ratio of just about 40% is not to be concerned about. What we need to watch is the trajectory and the direction it's going in. And right now, yes, it is going up. Bangladesh has moved from a rating of low risk of debt distress to moderate now. So that is what needs to be watched, right? Why has it moved from low to moderate? Are there chances that it might move from moderate to high, or are there chances that with reform actions or policy actions that it can move from moderate back to low? This is what needs to be watched out for. Right now, we're projecting small increments upwards, so an increase in that ratio, simply because, as you mentioned and others have observed, economic prospects have fallen a little bit in Bangladesh, right? The burden of servicing that debt is increasing. So when you have limited fiscal space, it starts becoming a thing to watch out for carefully. I mean, there's no need to ring alarm bells right now about this scenario, but we want this to be watched carefully so that it doesn't become a problem later on in future. What can be done? Again, there are a number of issues. At the most crude level, it's about thinking about how can the economy grow faster. What can be done about thinking about sources of financing, and then seeing how this all pans out over the next few years. I think I may have touched upon most of the things that were. So one final point. So actually, I'm not saying that we need to, Bangladesh needs to have a contractionary monetary policy. I'm saying maybe, given inflation is high, it might be the right stance not to change the policy stance, but its effectiveness as a tool for containing inflationary pressure may be limited by some of those factors you pointed out. If you're increasing, if you're providing liquidity, unsterilized liquidity injections, then yes, it will offset what you have by keeping a tight monetary policy rate. So I think we largely agree in most of the suggestions. If we haven't bored you too much at the end of the year, maybe we can come back with some focus on actual suggestions rather than the analysis part. That's up to you.
Inflation status. So at the end of this year, we will have some new, propositions coming out of the World Bank based on their research.
So we have come to the end. Good discussion, good paper. Look forward to December.
Yeah.
But just a little comment, because looking at I think the government's election time management, a lot of the things that they're addressing, but the key challenges will be this fiscal debt and the power and the electricity, the whole big subsidy issue on the electricity sector. But they have other things in there, so your help there will be good. And with that, we come to a close. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have